So imagine you were handed a document, right? And this document uses ancient Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and Syriac texts to completely dismantle, just break down one of the most common political assumptions of our time.
Right.
I mean, what if the most heavily armed geopolitical movement of our era, one that claims total divine authorization, is actually considered a rebellion against God by the very ancient texts it uses to justify itself?
It's a massive cognitive dissonance. You have this baseline assumption that a specific political state and an ancient religion are just the exact same thing, walking in lockstep.
Right.
But when you actually strip away the modern political talking points and you go straight back to the ancient languages, a completely different and frankly deeply controversial picture emerges.
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are looking at a multilingual thesis paper. It's titled Zionism, Judaism, and the Bible, a Critical Analysis. And it's authored by Frank Leo, who is also listed in the text as Moshe Levi. So our mission today, for you listening, is to explore how this author uses meticulously translated ancient scriptures to argue that Zionism actually isn't an extension of traditional Judaism.
Right.
But that it is fundamentally a rebellion against it.
Yeah, and before we dive into the text itself, I think we need to set a very clear boundary for this conversation.
Absolutely, yeah. Lay it out.
Because, this source deals with incredibly charged political and theological arguments, especially given the world we live in right now.
Oh, for sure.
So our role as your guides today is strictly to unpack the author's arguments impartially. We are not taking sides here. We are not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we condemning them.
Right. We are just looking at the mechanics.
Exactly. Our goal is simply to examine the really fascinating, rigorous way this author synthesizes these historical texts to build this case.
Totally. We are looking at the architecture of the argument, not telling you who to vote for or, what to believe.
Right.
So with that firmly established, okay, let's unpack this. The paper starts by dismantling this idea that anti-Zionism is just some, modern secular college campus phenomenon. It points out that opposition to this movement is actually deeply rooted in traditional historical Judaism itself.
Which is a historical reality that, frankly, often gets paved over in mainstream discussions.
Right.
I mean, from the very inception of the Zionist movement back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was fierce, organized opposition from many Haredi and Hasidic groups.
Like whose specifically? Does the author mention names?
Yeah, the text specifically highlights prominent, deeply Orthodox communities like Satmar, Tolda Aron, and Neturei Karta.
Okay.
And to these groups, the political project of Zionism wasn't viewed as a miraculous salvation. It was viewed as a theological catastrophe.
A catastrophe. I mean, that is a really heavy word to throw around.
It is.
So how do they justify that theologically? Why would, returning to the homeland be seen as a disaster by the most devout followers of the religion?
Well, to answer that, the paper points us to a seminal 1961 book called Vayol Moshe.
Okay, Vayol Moshe.
Yeah, and it was written by Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, who was the grand rabbi of the Satmar community.
Got it.
And his central thesis was that Zionism was a literal rebellion against God because it explicitly violated something known in Jewish law as the Three Oaths.
The Three Oaths. Okay, so this traces back to the Talmud, right?
Yes. He points to a very specific passage in the Babylonian Talmud in Ketubot 111a, and the paper actually provides the original text and the translations for this.
Oh, wow. So what are the oaths?
So according to this ancient passage, God made both Israel and the nations of the world swear 3 distinct oaths regarding the Jewish exile.
Okay.
The first oath is that Israel must not take the land by force, or the phrase used is go up as a wall.
Go up as a wall. That's such an interesting phrase, meaning what exactly? Like a militarized border.
Sort of, yeah. It generally refers to a mass, forceful, organized migration that's meant to establish sovereignty by human hands.
Gotcha. Okay, so no taking it by force. What's the second oath?
The second oath demands that Israel must not rebel against the nations of the world during their exile. They are meant to be peaceful inhabitants wherever they are scattered.
Okay, so that's 2 oaths for Israel. What about the third one? Because you mentioned the nations of the world swore an oath too.
Right. The third oath is a boundary set for the rest of the world. It dictates that the nations of the world must not overly enslave or oppress Israel.
Huh. So it's essentially like a divine 3-way non-disclosure agreement or a treaty.
Yeah, Exactly.
God put strict conditions on both sides of the equation.
Precisely. And to add a critical layer to this, the paper brings in the Mishnah, specifically Avot 5.9, which is another major work of rabbinic literature.
Yeah.
And this text frames the exile not just as some, historical accident.
Like bad luck against the Roman Empire.
Right, not just bad luck. It frames it as a specific divine prescription for very specific historical sins. Things like idolatry, immorality, bloodshed, and failing to observe the sabbatical year of the land.
Wow. It's almost like a doctor and a patient with a shattered leg.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Like the doctor says, look, you have to stay in bed for 6 months on strict bed rest. Do not put weight on this leg, or you will ruin it permanently.
Right.
That's the exile. It's a prescribed period of healing and correction. But then, the patient gets bored, decides they're healed on their own timeline, and they try to sneak out and run a marathon.
Exactly.
They might think they are taking charge of their health and fixing themselves, but they're actively destroying their recovery by rebelling against the doctor's orders.
That captures the theological mechanism perfectly. The core argument here is that ending the exile requires divine intervention.
Like the coming of the Messiah.
Right. It requires the Messiah, not human political engineering. By taking matters into their own hands, the secular founders of the state were, according to this Orthodox framework, actively rebelling against God's direct decree.
Okay, so if human intervention and military force violate the Talmudic oaths, that forces a massive question about the original biblical promise.
It does.
Because if you're listening to this, you know that the God promised us the land argument is basically the ultimate trump card played in modern geopolitical debates today.
Oh, absolutely. It's the conversation ender.
Right. But the paper argues that this card comes with a massive amount of fine print, doesn't it?
It really does. And this is where the paper's analysis of the prophet Hosea comes in, which completely flips that trump card on its head.
Okay, how so?
Well, the thesis here is that the biblical covenant was never a blank check. It wasn't just a permanent deed to a piece of real estate, regardless of behavior.
Right.
It was strictly legally conditional.
Conditional on what?
On fidelity to the Torah, on spiritual obedience. I mean, look at how the text treats Hosea chapter 1.
What's it say?
God is speaking to a deeply sinful, wayward Israel, and he actually commands the prophet to name a newborn child Lo-Ami.
Lo-Ami.
In Hebrew, that translates to not my people. The exact phrasing in Hosea 1.9 is brutal. It says, call his name Lo-Ami, for you are not my people and I will not be your God.
Wow. Not my people. I mean, that is a total severing of the contract.
It is. And what's fascinating here is the methodology the author uses to prove this point.
Yeah.
He doesn't just give you an English translation and ask you to trust it. He triangulates the text across multiple ancient languages.
Oh, really? So he brings in the other texts he mentioned at the start.
Exactly. He provides the original Hebrew, he provides the Greek Septuagint, which was the translation used by early Christians, and he provides the Aramaic Targum, the common language of the day.
Why go through all that linguistic trouble, though?
Because it proves this isn't some, modern translation error or political spin.
I see.
In every single ancient language, the consensus is identical. The covenant was broken by the people's infidelity. The promise was revoked.
Hold on, though. There's a glaring contradiction here that I have to push back on.
Okay, go for it.
The paper makes a big point of noting that the secular founders of Zionism, we're talking about historical figures like Theodore Herzl and David Ben-Gurion, they were fundamentally secular.
Yes.
Atheists, even. They openly rejected the religious framework of the Torah. So if they didn't even believe in the religion, why are they leaning on a biblical land grant in the first place?
Right.
Like, why use a Bible you don't even believe in to justify your politics?
That is exactly the hypocrisy this thesis is trying to expose. The argument suggests that these secular founders essentially hollowed out the religious, spiritual meaning of the covenant.
So they took out the burdensome requirement to actually obey the Torah.
Exactly. But they conveniently kept the political real estate claim.
So they wanted the deed to the house without having to pay the spiritual mortgage.
That's a great way to put it. They are claiming a divine right from a God they don't submit to, based on a covenant they actively reject and practice.
Wow.
The paper uses Hosea chapter 2 to drive this home, where the prophet likens Israel to an unfaithful spouse.
Mm-hmm.
It's framed as spiritual adultery. To claim the physical land while abandoning the spiritual law is, in this author's view, a total invalidation of the entire relationship.
Okay, so the paper establishes that From the perspective of the Old Testament prophets, the covenant was conditionally broken.
Yes.
But the analysis doesn't stop there, because it tracks this lo ante, this not my people concept, straight into the New Testament.
It does.
And this is where things get really paradigm shifting for anyone who grew up with standard Western religious narratives.
Right, because this is where the very definition of who constitutes Israel experiences a massive structural shift.
Okay, walk us through that.
The paper moves to the Apostle Paul, specifically Romans chapter 9. And again, the author provides the original Koine Greek and the Syriac Peshitta to lock in the meaning.
Nice.
Paul writes a phrase that essentially drops a bomb on ethnic nationalism. He says, quote, "Not all who are descended from Israel are Israel."
Not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. So he is explicitly divorcing the identity from the bloodline.
Entirely. Paul is arguing that being a child of the covenant isn't about DNA. It isn't about physical descent or tracing your ancestry back to a specific tribe.
Right, it's about something else entirely.
Exactly. It's about being a child of the promise. It's about spiritual belief and obedience.
And then the author layers in Peter too, right?
Yes, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 10. Peter actually directly quotes the prophet Hosea, that exact lo-emi concept we just talked about.
Oh, wow.
But he applies it to Gentile believers, people with zero physical connection to the land or the bloodline.
Okay.
Peter says, quote, "Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy."
So if you're listening to this and thinking about the geopolitics of today, this is where the ancient text slams right into modern news.
Yeah.
Is the author basically arguing that claiming a divine right to a piece of land based purely on your ethnic heritage is fundamentally unbiblical?
Yes, that is exactly the core pillar of his anti-Zionist thesis. He defines Zionism as a purely ethnic nationalism, and he argues that this is in direct contradiction to the New Testament principle. If being part of God's people is determined by spiritual obedience and faith, and not by your bloodline,
Right.
then an ethnic state cannot claim a divine mandate simply because of the DNA or ancestral heritage of its citizens.
It just changes the entire lens.
Completely.
But the paper doesn't just critique the founders from 100 years ago. It turns a very sharp, very uncomfortable lens on modern-day supporters.
It really does.
And it uses some ancient prophetic warnings that pull no punches.
No punches at all. The text applies the words of the prophets as a direct, blaring warning to anyone today who supports a state that, the paper argues, is built on systemic expulsion and occupation.
What verses does it use?
It brings in Isaiah 5.2n. "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness."
And it pairs that with Proverbs, right?
Yeah, Proverbs 17.15, which condemns anyone who acquits the guilty and condemns the innocent.
Okay, so the application here is pretty unflinching.
Very. The argument is that anyone who looks at violence, displacement, or militarized force and justifies those actions by calling them God's will or a divine promise is exactly who Isaiah and Proverbs were warning about. By stamping a holy seal of approval on human suffering, they are literally calling evil good.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. It's like taking a bulldozer or a military drone and just slapping a divine approval sticker on the side of it.
Yes, exactly that.
Wrapping geopolitical violence in the cloak of religion doesn't make the violence holy. It actually profanes the religion.
Right.
It's a severe condemnation of people who justify things under the guise of, say, national security, when those actions violate core ethical commandments.
It's the danger of weaponizing the sacred. And to reinforce that danger, the papal pulls from the Talmud again, Tractate Shabbat 139b.
What does that one say?
This text offers a very grim societal warning. It says that calamity comes to the world only because of the wicked, but the righteous are the first to suffer the consequences.
Man. Meaning, the innocent bystanders, the everyday people just trying to live their lives, they're the ones who pay the immediate physical price for the systemic evil justified by the powerful.
Exactly. The architects of the violence rarely suffer first. It's the innocent who bear the brunt. It's a profound systemic critique.
Yeah.
But if you think that's intense, this brings us to what is arguably the most provocative, radical part of the entire paper.
Oh, yes. This section was wild.
Yeah, the author dives deep into the apocalyptic imagery of the Book of Revelation to critique modern political identities.
Right. He takes the mark of the beast and completely reinterprets it away from how pop culture usually handles it.
He does. Because, you know, when most of us hear Mark of the Beast from Revelation 13, our minds immediately go to sci-fi tropes.
Oh, yeah. A physical barcode tattooed on the skin, a microchip injected into the hand. Some sort of dystopian tracking device.
Right, exactly. But the paper breaks down the original Greek word used by John of Patmos, which is charagma.
And charagma doesn't mean a microchip.
Not at all. In the first century Roman context, a charagma was often a seal of imperial allegiance. The paper argues that in the biblical spiritual context, this mark isn't a physical brand on the epidermis, it's symbolic.
Okay, symbolic how?
Well, it splits the concept into two parts, based on where Revelation says the mark is placed: the forehead and the hand.
Okay, so if it's not a barcode, what is the mark on the forehead?
The forehead represents the mind, the intellect, the ideology.
Right.
The author argues that intellectual and ideological support for this nationalist movement is the mark on the forehead. If you believe in its righteousness, if you adopt the ideology in your mind, you bear the mark.
Wow. And the mark on the hand.
The hand represents practical action. It's the physical execution of that belief in the real world.
So like donating money to the cause.
Yes. Donating money, voting for politicians who unconditionally fund it, participating in the military apparatus, silencing critics. That practical, worldly action is the mark on the hand.
That is a fascinating psychological reading of Revelation.
It really is.
But he takes it a step further by connecting it back to a very specific Old Testament practice, which I found incredibly compelling.
Yeah, the tefillin.
Right. He connects this mark of the beast to the Jewish practice of wearing tefillin, or phylacteries.
And this is where the synthesis of the text is really masterful. He points back to Deuteronomy 6.8, where God commands the Israelites to bind the words of the Torah as a sign on their hands and to bind them on their foreheads.
Okay.
The paper suggests that the mark of the beast in Revelation is actually meant to be read as an unholy, dark mirror image of this holy practice.
A dark mirror. I love that phrasing.
Yeah.
Explain how that works in the context of the argument.
Well, instead of binding your thoughts, your forehead, and your actions, your hand, to God's law and spiritual obedience, you are binding your thoughts and actions to a corrupt, worldly political system.
So you are taking the mechanism of divine devotion and redirecting it toward human empire.
Yes, exactly.
That is a stunning way to connect the two testaments. But the author goes even further into Revelation, and frankly, this is where I have to throw up a flag.
Okay, let's hear it.
He tackles Revelation 2.9, which uses the phrase, the synagogue of Satan.
Right.
And historically, we know that phrases like that have been weaponized in horrific, deeply anti-Semitic ways over the centuries.
Absolutely.
So given how rigorously this paper is grounded in Scripture, how does the author justify using such explosive, historically dangerous terminology?
It's a vital question, and the paper is very careful to define its theological justification here to avoid exactly that kind of racial weaponization.
Okay.
The author isn't using it as an ethnic slur. He applies the phrase, specifically the part that says, those who say they are Jews and are not, strictly to secular Zionist and nationalist ideology.
But how does he define the and are not part? Like, how can he say someone with Jewish heritage is not Jewish?
He grounds it entirely in the Apostle Paul's theology, going back to Romans chapter 2. Paul writes that a true Jew is not one outwardly, by physical circumcision or mere DNA.
Right.
A true Jew is one inwardly, circumcised of the heart by the Spirit.
So it's about the internal spiritual reality, not the external demographic marker.
Precisely. The argument is that secular nationalists who use Jewish identity purely for political cover, for a flag, a state, a military, while simultaneously desecrating the Sabbath and rejecting the Torah, are wearing a false identity. To the author, they are the ones who say they are Jews and are not, because they've discarded the spiritual obedience that actually defines the identity in the ancient texts.
So it's an indictment of using faith as a political costume.
Yes. And the text notes that even so-called religious Zionists fall into this category if they twist the Torah to justify violence, theft, and oppression.
Because by doing so, they are violating the very spirit of the law they claim to uphold.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. This has been an incredibly dense, intense journey through this thesis. We have covered a lot of ground.
We really have.
So let's summarize the core of what this paper is arguing. According to this meticulously researched multilingual document, Zionism is not a continuation of Judaism. It is a secular nationalist movement that hijacked ancient biblical promises for modern geopolitical gain.
Yes.
And the paper proves this was a stance initially held by prominent historical rabbis. And it argues that ethnic nationalism is fundamentally at odds with the textual conditions of the biblical covenant itself, a covenant that demands spiritual obedience and justice, not just a bloodline.
That perfectly encapsulates the architecture of the argument. And The author actually leaves the reader with a final textual warning.
Oh, what is it?
It's from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. He provides it in the Hebrew alongside the translations.
Okay, what does it say?
It reads, "Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless."
Man, that is a stark warning about writing systemic injustice into the law itself and then claiming God signed the legislation.
It is, and we should highlight the author's methodology one last time by providing all of these quotes in their original ancient languages. The Greek, the Hebrew, the Aramaic, the Syriac. He is laying all his cards on the table.
Yeah.
He's not asking for blind trust. He's inviting the reader to check his work, to test the truth of his translations for themselves.
Which is exactly what we've tried to do today by exploring the mechanics of his argument.
Right.
And just to reiterate one last time, because it is so important, we've been exploring this author's specific, highly detailed synthesis of these ancient texts.
Yes.
We aren't taking a political stance on the modern conflict. We're analyzing a fascinating piece of academic and theological rhetoric.
Exactly. How you interpret these ancient warnings and what stands out to you as truth is ultimately up to how you engage with the text.
Right. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. We spent this entire deep dive looking at how a scholar uses scriptures from thousands of years ago to argue about the legitimacy of a modern state. Think about that for a second. Think about how an ancient text, written millennia ago, by candlelight in a completely different world, is still the ultimate trump card people try to play in modern geopolitical conflicts today.
It's crazy to think about.
What does that say about us? What does it say about our deep, inherently human need to find divine authorization for the literal lines we draw on a map today?
Right.
It's like we are still, after all these centuries, desperately looking for an ancient X-ray to show us exactly where the borders of right and wrong are supposed to be. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.